Corinna Hallett was sold to the Earl of Dunmore for £3,200 on the 14th of June to settle a land dispute her uncle could not otherwise resolve. The arrangement was called a household appointment. The paperwork described her as a secretary to the estate office. Her uncle Earl Hallett, who had been her father's younger brother and her guardian since she was 19, signed the documents in the parlour of his solicitor's office in Ashford without looking at her once. She had not been invited to the signing. She had stood in the corridor outside and listened through a door that was not quite closed. The coach from Ashford to Dunmore Hall took 4 hours. She sat on the right side and watched the countryside go from low farmland to the kind of rolling hills that meant old money and old stone, and she kept her hands folded in her lap with the gloves buttoned to the elbow. The July heat came through the coach window in steady pulses. Across from her, the hired coachman's assistant had his sleeves rolled to the forearm and was eating an apple without particular self-consciousness. She did not remove the gloves. They arrived at Dunmore Hall in the late afternoon. The house was enormous and grey and practical looking without the decorative excess of newer money. A housekeeper named Mrs. Osborne came out to receive her, a tall woman in her 60s with a precise face and the posture of someone who had been in service her entire adult life and had made peace with it. Miss Hallett, the woman's eyes went to the gloves, July, buttoned to the elbow. She said nothing else about it. Mrs. Osborne, Corinna picked up her own bag. The housekeeper reached for it. "I'll have that sent up." "I have it, thank you." She was not being difficult. She had simply been carrying her own bag since she was 19 years old, and the habit was too settled to break on a gravel drive. Her rooms were on the second floor of the east wing, larger than she had expected, with windows that faced south and a writing desk already positioned near them. She stood in the centre of the room and took a slow breath and understood that this was her life now, or the beginning of it, and that she had not chosen it, but that she had also, in a practical and specific sense, run completely out of other options. She was 24 years old. She was the new secretary to the Earl of Dunmore's estate office. She had not chosen to be. That was the plain truth of it. Her father, William Hallett, had been the clerk of the county court in Ashford for 22 years. He was a quiet man with a methodical mind and a genuine love for the architecture of legal documents. The way a properly drafted instrument told a story if you knew how to read it. The way the Latin clauses built on each other in a logical sequence that was almost beautiful when it was done right. He had taught Corinna to read law the way other fathers teach their daughters music. Slowly, with patience, with the expectation that she would eventually be better at it than he was. She had been. By the time she was 17, she could identify a fraudulent amendment to a contract by the pressure difference in the ink. A clause inserted, after the original signing, always sat differently on the page, always came from a pen held by a hand that was slightly more anxious than the original drafters. She could read legal Latin as easily as English. She could follow the logic of a conveyance document and tell you within 3 minutes where the weakness was, where a clever lawyer could argue, where the language had been left deliberately loose. Her father had said she had the finest legal mind he had ever seen in a person who would never be permitted to practice law. He died of a fever when she was 19. Her uncle Arden came the following month. Arden Hallett was a man who understood money primarily as something other people had, and he wanted. He had spent most of his adult life in the margins of legitimate business ventures, never quite crossing into illegality, never quite generating real income. When William died, Arden had assessed his brother's household with the calm, practical interest of an appraiser valuing an estate, and identified 2 assets: the house which he sold, and Corinna, who was young and educated and would eventually be useful. The useful moment arrived 4 years later when a land dispute went badly wrong and Arden needed £3,200 he did not have. The Earl of Dunmore, it turned out, needed someone who could manage his estate paperwork. Arden had presented this as an opportunity. Corinna had understood it as something else entirely. She had packed her trunk the night before the coach came. At the bottom, under her father's law books, she had placed the small leather notebook where she kept the things she had observed about her uncle's financial arrangements over the years, things she had not known what to do with yet. The Earl of Dunmore arrived home 2 days after she did. She was in the estate office when he came, a long, low room on the ground floor, with north-facing windows and shelves that held 40 years of property documents in a state that suggested they had been filed by someone who had given up halfway through and never returned. She was going through the third shelf from the left when she heard the front hall change. The sound of boots on stone, the specific quality of quiet that fell over a house when its owner walked through the door. She did not go to meet him. Mrs. Osborne had said he would come to the office when he was ready. He arrived in the doorway 20 minutes later. He was 35 or so, with the kind of face that had been handsome once and was now more interesting than handsome. Tired in a specific way. The way men are tired when they have been managing something difficult for a long time and have become so accustomed to it that they have stopped noticing the effort. He was in riding clothes. He looked at the shelves she had been reorganizing, and then at her. "Miss Hallett," his voice was even and deliberate. "My lord," she kept her hands at her sides. The gloves were on. They were always on. "I understand you've been in the office since yesterday morning. The filing system needed attention. I thought it better to start immediately." He looked at the shelves again. She had separated the property deeds from the correspondence, grouped the deeds by year, and flagged 3 folders that seemed to contain documents that should not have duplicates. She had not mentioned the flagged folders to Mrs. Osborne. She was not sure yet what she was looking at. "Is there anything you require?" he asked. "A lamp for evening work," she said. "The light from the windows fails by 4 o'clock. "I'll arrange it." He was already turning. Then he paused and looked back. And the look was not what she expected, not assessing, not dismissive. Something more careful than either. "My solicitor will come Thursday to go over the formal terms of your appointment. If you have questions before then, Mrs. Osborne can assist." "Thank you, my lord." He left. She stood for a moment in the office with the flagged folders on the desk in front of her, and felt something she recognized, the specific alertness of a person who has noticed something that does not yet have a name. The Dowager Countess Celeste Dunmore arrived the following morning. She was the Earl's mother, 63 years old, widowed 15 years ago, and she occupied a dower house on the south side of the property with the authority of a person who had never fully accepted that her residency in the main house had technically ended. She came and went as she liked. She sat in rooms she had furnished herself before the current Earl was born. She received her mail at the hall. She came into the estate office at 10 o'clock while Corinna was working and stood in the doorway and looked at her the way a person looks at a piece of furniture that has been moved from where they left it. "You're smaller than I expected," Lady Celeste said. "I'm sorry to disappoint." The older woman's eyes went to the gloves. "You work in gloves." "I find the documents dusty. The gloves protect my hands." This was not untrue. It was also not the reason. Lady Celeste sat in the chair by the window, her chair clearly from the way she settled into it without checking. "My son is too trusting," she said pleasantly. "It's a flaw I've tried to address. He sees someone in a difficult position and assumes the difficulty is genuine." She paused. "I have seen women in your position before, educated, capable, charming in their way. They come in through a side door, and within 6 months they have made themselves indispensable, and within a year they are in a position none of us agreed to." Her voice remained pleasant. It was the pleasantness of a woman who had been practicing it for 60 years. "I want you to understand, Miss Hallett, that I see exactly what you are. Stay in your office, do your work, and do not reach for anything beyond it, and we will have no difficulty." Corinna looked up from the document. "Thank you for the clarity," she said. Lady Celeste studied her for a moment. She had expected a different response, more deference or more fear. She stood, smoothed her dress, and left. Corinna sat still for 30 seconds after she heard the footsteps fade. Then she turned back to the document she had been reading when the Dowager arrived. It was a property deed amendment from 9 years ago, covering a parcel of land on the north boundary. The amendment added a clause in Latin that transferred quarterly revenue from that parcel to a holding account managed by the estate steward. The Latin was correct, technically, But the sentence structure was not the structure a trained legal draftsman would use. It was the Latin of someone who had learned it well, but not natively, who had studied the forms and reproduced them, but could not quite replicate the rhythm. She had seen this before. Her father had shown her a case like it once, a codicil added by a clerk who thought he was clever. She found 3 more amendments in the same hand before noon. By the end of the second week, she had found 7. The steward's name was Harwick, a compact, watchful man of about 50 who had managed the Dunmore estate for 11 years. He had been cordial to her at first, the careful cordiality of a man assessing a new variable in an arrangement he had considered settled. When she began asking Mrs. Osborne for the original delivery receipts from the North Boundary Farms, receipts that should have matched the quarterly account totals, Harwick's cordiality developed a particular edge. "Those records are filed," he told her, on a Tuesday morning when she had come looking for a specific quarter from 6 years ago. "I'd like to review them for the current audit." "That's not how we've done the audit." "I understand. I'd like to try a different method." She kept her voice level. "Could I have the receipts from the 3rd quarter of 1817, please?" He got them. She took them back to the office and closed the door and sat down with the lamp the Earl had arranged for evening work, and she went through them line by line. The Earl found her at 9 o'clock that evening, still at the desk. He stood in the doorway with a cup of tea. He had apparently been intending to leave on the threshold without disturbing her, and then stopped when he registered that she was not simply working, but working at a particular kind of intensity. The kind that means someone has found something and is not yet sure what to do with it. "What have you found?" he said. It was not quite a question. She looked up. In the lamplight, he looked less tired than he did in the day, or perhaps it was just that the evening had removed some of the performance of being composed. "A discrepancy," she said. "Several of them. I want to be certain before I say more." He came into the room and sat across the desk, not to take the documents from her, just to be there, present, in the specific way of someone who understands that a person doing careful work should not be interrupted, but should not either be left entirely alone with it. "My father taught me to read contracts," she said, after a moment. "He was the county clerk in Ashford for 22 years. He said a fraudulent clause always has the same quality as a lie, told by someone who learned the truth second-hand. It sounds right, but the rhythm is wrong." He looked at her steadily. "Show me." She turned the document so he could read it. She pointed to the amendment clause. She explained in plain English what the Latin said, what it should have said, and where the rhythm was wrong. He was quiet for a long moment, then, "How many?" "7 that I'm certain of. There may be more." "Continue," he said. "Take whatever records you need." He paused. "If Harwick gives you difficulty, tell me." He stood. At the doorway he stopped and turned back, and the expression on his face was the one she had been watching for since she arrived. Not the formal distance of the Earl performing his role, but something underneath it. "Miss Hallett," he said, "the gloves." She held his gaze. "In July," he said, "in the office all day." She said nothing. "I'm not asking tonight," he said, "but I will ask." He left. She sat with the lamp burning low and her hands on the desk, gloves on, buttons done, and she was not afraid. Fear had left her the way things leave you after you have carried them long enough, gradually, without announcement, until one day you realize it is no longer the heaviest thing you are holding. The dinner was in August. 14 guests at the long table in the formal dining room. Lord Hartwell, the county magistrate with his wife, 3 families of the local gentry arranged in pairs, 2 of the Earl's colleagues from Parliament in the county for the summer recess, Lady Celeste, who had not been explicitly invited and had not been explicitly excluded, arrived at 7:15 and took her seat as though the chair had been placed there in anticipation of her. Corinna stood in the entrance hall and received the guests as they arrived. She had been managing household dinners since she was 16, when her father's position required it, and there was no one else to do it. She knew how to introduce, how to bridge silences, how to draw out a quiet guest and redirect an overbearing one. She was good at it the way she was good at contracts, by paying attention to what was actually happening rather than what was supposed to be happening. She had also that morning asked Mrs. Osborne about the table arrangement. The full complement of 14 guests placed the Earl at the head and Corinna as hostess at the opposite end, which meant she sat with her back to the sideboard and the south wall, facing the length of the table, with 6 guests along each side running between them. Everyone at the table had a clear line of sight to Corinna's seat. She had noted this without comment and gone back to the office. Lady Celeste watched her from the moment she sat down. The first 2 courses passed without incident. The conversation moved, the wine was poured. Lord Hartwell said something about the summer recess that made the Earl smile briefly. Corinna noted the smile and filed it away without allowing herself to examine it too closely. It was during the 3rd course that Lady Celeste moved. She leaned forward, as though reaching past the woman beside her for the bread basket, and her hand came to rest on Corinna's arm. It was done with the ease of a woman who had spent 60 years making deliberate things appear casual. Her fingers found the pearl buttons at the wrist of Corinna's left glove. Corinna understood what was happening in the same moment it began. She did not move quickly enough, or perhaps she did not move at all. She had been so careful, for so long, about never flinching, that the muscle memory of stillness betrayed her. The glove came off. The room had 14 people in it, and every one of them had a direct sight line to the head of the table where Corinna sat. The lamplight caught the burn scars across her left forearm without mercy, wide, red-haired white, settled into the skin, the precise shape of a document seal, pressed there 4 years ago by a man who had wanted her to release what she was holding and had used the only argument he had left. The silence was total. No one moved. No glass was set down. Lord Hartwell, who had been speaking when Lady Celeste's hand moved, stopped mid-sentence and did not finish it. The woman to Corinna's left made a small sound and then controlled it. Across the table, a man Corinna barely knew looked at his plate and did not look up again. Lady Celeste looked at what she had exposed. She had expected something she could use. A birthmark, perhaps, or a minor imperfection. Something she could comment on with the particular mild cruelty she had spent decades perfecting. She had not calculated for this. The triumph she had come to this table to collect had lasted less than a second, and what replaced it was visible in her face before she could arrange against it. Recognition, and beneath it, the specific horror of a woman who understood exactly what she was looking at. Corinna sat perfectly still. She was composed. She had learned composure the way she had learned contract law, by necessity, in conditions where any other choice had consequences. She looked at the centre of the table. She did not look at anyone. She did not speak. The Earl rose from his seat. He did it the way he did everything, without theatrics, without announcement. He simply stood, and the room understood from the way he stood that something was happening that required attention. He walked the length of the table. Every guest watched. He stopped beside Corinna's chair, and he took her left hand in both of his, the scarred one, the exposed one, with the care of someone handling something that matters. Then he turned to face his mother. The room held its breath. "Leave my house tonight," he said. Lady Celeste's face had gone rigid. "Rupert." Her voice had none of its usual pleasant distance. She has been manoeuvring since the moment she arrived. The accounts, the office, positioning herself as indispensable. She is not what she appears to be. "Leave my house tonight." The same words, quieta the second time, which made them more final rather than less. She looked at him for a long moment, reading for the version of her son she knew, the one who had always eventually made room for her. That version was not in this room. She looked at Corinna, and Corinna looked back at her without moving. Lady Celeste stood. She set her napkin down. She walked to the door and through it, and her footsteps faded down the corridor. And then there was only the careful sound of 12 people trying to remember how to breathe. Corinna sat with her hand in Rupert's and felt the table watching them both, and understood that whatever came next would be decided in the next 30 seconds. Rupert released her hand gently and turned to face the room. He did not return to his seat. He picked up a folder from the sideboard behind him. She recognized it. She had assembled it 2 days ago at his request, and given it to Mrs. Osborne to keep. "Before we continue," he said, addressing the table with the ease of someone who had been preparing for precisely this moment. "There is a matter that Lord Hartwell's presence this evening makes appropriate to raise." He set the folder on the table and opened it. "Several of you will know the name Harwick. He has managed this estate for 11 years. In that time, he has amended 11 property deeds to redirect a portion of the quarterly land revenues into a secondary account under his own control. The total amount removed from the Dunmore estate across those 11 years is approximately £9,400. Lord Hartwell reached for the top document without being asked. "My secretary identified the fraudulent amendments," Rupert said. He looked at Corinna now, directly and without the careful distance he had worn like a second skin for 6 weeks. She identified them in her first week. She documented everyone. She has prepared a full annotated record cross-referencing each amendment to the original deed. Corinna picked up the second document from the folder. Her left hand was bare. The scars caught the lamplight and she let them. She read, clearly, methodically, in the way her father had taught her, naming the figures, the dates, the specific language of each fraudulent clause, the Latin that was almost but not quite right, the handwriting that matched across 11 years, the delivery receipts that did not match the invoiced totals. She read for 6 minutes without trembling, and when she finished, the table was silent. Lord Hartwell looked up. "You identified these yourself?" "My father was the county clerk in Ashford for 22 years, she said. "He taught me to read instruments. I found the first amendment in my second day here. I wanted to be certain before I brought it forward." The magistrate nodded once, with the full weight of a man whose nod carries legal consequence. "I'll need to speak with your steward tonight." "He is in the house," Rupert said. "Mrs. Osborne has been asked to keep him here." Hartwell excused himself with the folder under his arm. The dinner resumed, not as it had been. Something had broken open and resettled, and the conversation that followed had the careful, deliberate quality of people who understood that dignity was a practice rather than a feeling, and who were genuinely trying to practice it. At the end of the evening, as the last guests collected their wraps in the entrance hall, Lord Hartwell's wife found Corinna by the fire. "Your father would be proud," she said simply, and moved on before Corinna could answer. She stood there for a moment with that sentence, and felt it settle somewhere it had been needed for a long time. Howick was taken into custody before the last carriage left the drive. Her Uncle Arden's arrangement, it emerged through Rupert's London solicitors, had rested on guardianship papers that contained the same kind of fraudulent insertion she had spent 6 weeks identifying in the Dunmore deeds. He had never held legal authority over her to begin with. The assize court would see both cases in September. Corinna sat alone in the estate office long after the house had gone quiet. The lamp was burning low. The documents she had spent 6 weeks working through were stacked on the left side of the desk, annotated and complete. Her left glove was on the corner of the desk. She had not reached for it, and she did not reach for it now. She looked at her arm for a while. The scars were what they were, the permanent record of one specific night 4 years ago, when she had tried to take documents out of her uncle's house, and he had pressed the seal iron into her arm to make her release them. She had released them. They had burned the papers anyway. She had kept the memory of every number on those documents. She had not needed the paper. She pressed her palms flat on the surface of the desk. The oak was cool and solid under her hands. After a while, there was a knock at the open door. Rupert stood there in the low light with his coat off and nothing formal left in his expression at all. "I wanted to see if you were all right," he said. "I am," she said, and then, because it was true, and because she had spent long enough not saying true things, "I don't think I've been all right in quite some time. I think tonight I might be starting to be." He came into the room and sat across from her, the way he had sat that evening when she had first shown him the claws. He was quiet for a moment. "I saw the gloves the day you arrived," he said. "July, that particular heat. I told myself it wasn't my place to ask." "It wasn't," she said then. "No." He looked at the desk. "My wife came from a difficult household. I knew it before I brought her here. I told myself that removing her from it was enough, that the solution was simply being somewhere else." His jaw tightened. She died 2 years after we married, a fever, not related to any of it. But I have spent 2 years asking myself whether I saw clearly enough, whether I moved early enough, whether I chose my own comfort over speed." She looked at him steadily. "You moved tonight." "I should have moved sooner." "Yes," she agreed, because there was no useful comfort in arguing with it. "But you moved." He looked at her then, without any of the careful distance that had been his register for the past 6 weeks. She could see what was underneath it, the specific expression of a man who has been managing something at arm's length for too long, and has just put it down. "Corinna," he said, her name plainly. "Rupert," she said. He reached across the desk and took her left hand in both of his. The same way he had at the table, but different, here with no audience and no performance required of either of them. Just the careful, exact way of a person who understands that what they are holding has a history and is handling it accordingly. They sat like that for a while, in the estate office, with the lamp burning low and the documents stacked neatly on the desk, while the August night outside the window asked nothing of them and required nothing of them, and offered them only the simple fact of being in the same room without having to manage it. 2 years later, on a Tuesday morning in October, when the copper beeches along the North Drive had gone the colour of old pennies, Corinna sat at the estate desk with the quarterly revenue reports spread in front of her and a cup of tea that had gone cold beside the lamp. The desk was hers now. Had been formerly, by deed of appointment signed and witnessed, for 18 months, the first woman to hold the position of estate secretary at Dunmore Hall since the hall had been built. The county solicitor who drafted the appointment had done so in Latin that was entirely correct in both structure and rhythm, which she had checked before she signed. She was reading the third report when the door opened, and Rupert came in with a letter from their man in London and their son James on his hip, 14 months old, with his father's grey eyes, and, apparently, his mother's opinion that being set down on the floor was an imposition to be loudly contested. Rupert was managing the contest with the particular resigned competence of a man who had been losing it for several months and had no expectation of improvement. "Harwick's appeal was denied," he said, handing her the letter. "I know. Hartwell's brief came this morning." She took the letter, scanned the last paragraph, set it in the left stack. "Third quarter is up 4%. "I read your summary." "The summary doesn't have the detail." "It has your detail." He set James down on the rug, accepted the loss of whatever equilibrium that represented, and pulled the chair to the other side of the desk. "That's different from other people's detail." James examined the rug with the focused gravity of a person for whom the rug was new information. Corinna moved the nearest document out of reach, handed him the blunt end of a letter opener to investigate instead, and turned back to the third column of the report. The fire made the room warm and gold. Rupert opened the London correspondence. After a while, James dropped the letter opener, picked it up, dropped it again, and appeared to find this entirely satisfying. Corinna looked up from the report. The gloves were on the corner of the desk where she had set them when she came in, not on her hands. They had not been on her hands regularly for more than a year, not since the morning she woke up in Dunmore Hall and understood, with the specific clarity that comes only after a very long time of not understanding, that she was in a room she did not need to leave. She had arrived at this house in July wearing gloves buttoned to the elbow in a heat that made no sense for gloves. She had stood in the entrance hall and known plainly that she had been sold by a man who had counted on her having no standing to refuse and no standing to fight back. He had not been wrong about the standing. He had been profoundly wrong about what standing was for. Rupert looked up from his letter and found her looking at him. He raised one eyebrow. She picked up her pen. "Go back to your letter," she said. "I found an error in the third column." He smiled, a real one, the kind that had taken 9 months to arrive and had stayed, and went back to his letter. Corinna turned to the third column, found the error 3 lines down, and made a note in the margin in the clean, precise hand her father had taught her. Outside, the October light was thin and clear through the south windows. James said something emphatic to the letter opener. The fire crackled once and settled. The gloves stayed where they were.